Jacob Morrison had built his life on hard work, trust, and love. As the owner of a thriving restaurant and a devoted father to his daughter Emily, he believed he had it all until one fateful night changed everything. A devastating car accident left him clinging to life in a hospital bed. But it wasn't the crash that broke him. It was what he overheard while lying helpless. His wife Clara's cold, calculating betrayal. She wasn't waiting for him to recover. She was plotting to take his wealth, his business, and his legacy. As Jacob struggled to process the magnitude of her deception, he realized he had to act not just to save his livelihood, but to protect Emily from being drawn into Clara's schemes. Yet, Jacob's journey back wasn't one he faced alone. A selfless stranger who pulled him from the wreckage, a kind-hearted nurse who refused to give up on him, and an unexpected ally from his restaurant all became key to his fight for justice. Along the way, Jacob uncovered Clara's secrets, reclaimed his strength, and rediscovered what truly mattered in life. But betrayal cuts deep, and rebuilding from the ashes isn't easy. Will Jacob find the courage to face the woman who nearly destroyed him? Can he protect Emily while navigating the wreckage of his once perfect world? The sterile smell of disinfectant lingered in the air, blending with the steady hum of life support machines. Jacob Morrison opened his eyes to a harshly lit room, the ceiling blurring in and out of focus. A heavy, dull ache radiated through his body, pinning him down against the stiff hospital mattress. He blinked slowly, trying to make sense of his surroundings. Where was he? And why did every movement feel like a monumental task? Fragments of memory floated just beyond his reach, taunting him with their incompleteness. His chest rose and fell with shallow breaths as he turned his head slightly, groaning at the effort. A faint pain pricked his temples, and his arms felt leaden, weighed down by unfamiliar tubes and wires. "Where am I?" Jacob whispered hoarsely, though his voice sounded alien to him, weak and gravelly. The world around him seemed distant, like a dream he was struggling to wake from. He tried to lift his hand, but it barely twitched. The rhythmic beeping of the monitors nearby was the only indication of time passing. His gaze drifted to the pale walls, sparsely decorated with a clock and a single generic painting of a field. It was so lifeless, so clinical. He thought of home, of the warmth of his study, with its cluttered desk and the faint smell of pine wood from the fireplace. Then it hit him. Home. Emily. Clara. He tried to recall the events that led him here, but his mind was a blank slate, stubbornly refusing to provide answers. Panic bubbled under the surface, but he forced himself to calm down. He needed to think. Moments later, a muffled voice broke the stillness. Jacob turned his head slowly toward the sound. The door to his room was slightly ajar, and beyond it, he heard a familiar voice. It was Clara, his wife. "How much longer do we have to wait?" Clara said, her tone clipped and impatient. "The lawyers assured me everything would be settled by now." Jacob froze. His heart, weak as it felt, began to race. The voice was hers, no doubt about it, but there was something in her tone that sent a shiver down his spine. It lacked the warmth and concern he expected from her, especially now. A second voice, deep and unfamiliar, replied, "It takes time, Clara. Wills are complicated, especially when someone has an estate as large as his." Jacob's mind reeled. Wills? Estate? What was she talking about? And the doctors? Clara pressed. "Are they still saying there's hope?" The stranger's response was hesitant. "They think he might recover, but he's still weak. Anything could happen." Jacob clenched his fists, or tried to, but his hands remained motionless. His breathing grew ragged as he processed the words. Clara's voice again cut through the fog. "Well," she said, a cold edge creeping into her voice. "Let's hope it doesn't come to that." Jacob's stomach dropped. He lay perfectly still, the weight of her words settling over him like a suffocating blanket. What was she saying? Why would his own wife talk about him this way? The betrayal was sharper than any physical pain he had endured. As Clara's voice faded, Jacob closed his eyes and fought back the tears welling up. His mind raced through the years they had spent together building a life, raising Emily, enduring the highs and lows of marriage. He thought of the nights he had stayed late at work to ensure their future was secure. Had it all been a lie? Had she been waiting for the first sign of weakness to turn on him? He swallowed hard, his throat dry and raw. The ache in his body felt insignificant compared to the ache in his heart. No, this isn't over. Not yet. Hours passed. Or perhaps it was minutes. It was hard to tell in the haze of pain and exhaustion. A soft knock at the door startled him, and he cracked his eyes open to see a nurse enter. She was in her late 20s with kind, clear eyes and a gentle demeanor. Her name tag read Erica Bennett. "Good morning, Mr. Morrison," Erica said softly, her voice soothing. "Let's check how you're doing today." Jacob wanted to respond, but his throat was parched and no words came out. Erica noticed and quickly poured a small cup of water, tilting it carefully against his lips. The cool liquid was a relief, and Jacob managed a faint nod. "Your vitals are stable," she said, glancing at the monitors. "That's a good sign. You're a fighter." Fighter. The word struck him. Did she know what he had just overheard? Of course not. She was just being encouraging. But something about her presence felt genuine, unforced. "Thank you," Jacob rasped, surprising himself with the effort. Erica paused, her hand hovering over the 4 drip. "You're welcome. If there's anything you need, just press the call button, okay?" Jacob nodded, though he doubted he would. He didn't want to bring more attention to himself. For now, he needed to think, to plan. But as Erica adjusted his pillows and checked his 4-line, he caught her glancing at him, her brow furrowed with concern. "Are you in pain?" she asked. "Not, just tired," he replied. His voice still sounded faint, even to himself. She smiled gently. "Rest is the best thing for you now. Don't push yourself too hard." As Erica left the room, Jacob felt a faint flicker of something he hadn't felt since overhearing Clara's conversation. Hope. He didn't know why, but her simple act of kindness, ensuring he was comfortable, treating him with dignity, felt like a lifeline. Later that evening, as the hospital quieted down, Jacob found himself staring at the ceiling again. Sleep was elusive, his mind replaying Clara's words on a loop. He felt a surge of anger, then shame. He had been so blind. Was this his fault? Had he been so consumed with work that he failed to see the cracks in their relationship? A faint rustling at the door caught his attention. He turned his head slowly and saw an older man in a janitor's uniform stepping in. The man pushed a mop bucket ahead of him, his movements deliberate and unhurried. "Evening, sir," the janitor said, his voice gravelly but kind. "Just doing my rounds. Won't take but a minute." Jacob didn't respond, but the man's presence was oddly comforting. He moved about the room quietly, whistling a soft tune under his breath. Before leaving, the janitor turned and gave Jacob a small smile. "Hang in there, Mr. Morrison," he said. "Tough times don't last, but tough people do." The words hit Jacob like a bolt of lightning. He didn't know this man, had never seen him before, but the sincerity in his voice was undeniable. Tears pricked Jacob's eyes, and he blinked them away. Tough people. Was he tough enough to get through this? As the janitor left, Jacob felt the faintest spark ignite within him. He wasn't sure what the coming days would bring, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to give up. Not now. Not ever. The rest of the night passed in fits and starts, with moments of restless sleep and lucid wakefulness. By morning, Jacob felt a strange mix of exhaustion and determination. He didn't know how, but he would find a way to recover, not just physically, but emotionally. The betrayal he had uncovered felt like a wound that might never fully heal. But in the kindness of strangers, Erica's gentle care, the janitor's unexpected encouragement, he had found a glimmer of light in the darkness. Jacob stared out the small window of his room as the first rays of dawn crept over the horizon. The world outside seemed indifferent to his pain, yet it kept moving forward. And so, the next morning, Jacob awoke to the soft patter of rain against the hospital window. His body still felt like it was made of stone, but his mind was clearer than it had been the day before. The sharp edges of the previous day's revelations pressed at him, though he wasn't yet ready to confront them. He focused instead on the room around him, taking in the muted colors and the orderly neatness of the space. It was a sterile sanctuary, holding him in limbo between the life he had built and the chaos that awaited him outside. The door creaked open, and Erica entered, her calm presence once again filling the room. She carried a clipboard, but her smile softened the efficiency of her demeanor. "Good morning, Mr. Morrison," she said warmly, setting the clipboard aside. "How are you feeling today?" Jacob mustered a faint smile. "Better, I think," he replied, though the word felt foreign in his mouth. He wasn't better, not really, but there was a flicker of something in him, strength, perhaps that hadn't been there before. Erica adjusted his foredrip and checked the monitors. As she worked, Jacob studied her face, noticing the small signs of someone who had been through her own battles. Faint shadows under her eyes, a quiet resilience in her movements. She was young, probably in her late 20s, yet she carried herself with the steadiness of someone older. "You're improving," she said, her voice laced with encouragement. "Your vitals are stronger today. That's a good sign." Jacob nodded, grateful for her optimism, though the weight in his chest remained. He wanted to tell her about Clara, about the conversation he had overheard. But what could she do? Erica was a nurse, not a confidant. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice quiet but sincere. Erica's small acts of kindness were beginning to feel like lifelines, threads pulling him back from the abyss. Later that afternoon, when Erica had gone and the room was still, Jacob tried to piece together his memories. He could now recall flashes of the accident headlights slicing through the dark, the sickening crunch of metal, the acrid smell of gasoline. He remembered the sharp pain that had spread through his chest as he lay trapped, the world blurring around him. What he couldn't remember was who had pulled him out. Someone must have risked their life to save him, but the details eluded him, slipping away every time he reached for them. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps in the hallway. The voices returned: Clara's voice, sharp and impatient, followed by the deeper tone of the man she had been speaking to the night before. Jacob tensed, his body stiffening as they approached. "I told you, it's just a matter of time," Clara said, her tone clipped. "The lawyers will sort it out. All we have to do is wait." "And if he recovers?" the man asked, his voice low and cautious. "What then?" Clara laughed, the sound chilling in its coldness. "Recover? He's barely holding on. Besides, I've been managing just fine without him. The businesses practically run themselves." Jacob felt his heart sink. She was already speaking as though he were gone, as though he were nothing more than a name on a bank account. His jaw tightened, and he fought the urge to cry out, to let her know that he was still here, still fighting. "I still think you're taking a risk," the man continued. "If he wakes up, things could get messy." Clara's reply was sharp. "Then we'll deal with it. I'm not letting him ruin everything I've worked for. Not after all this time." Jacob closed his eyes, the weight of her words crushing him. Everything she had worked for? Hadn't it been his work, his sacrifices, that had built their life together? He thought of the long nights he had spent in his office, poring over contracts and balancing budgets, while Clara enjoyed the fruits of his labor. He had done it for her, for their family. How could she throw it all away so easily? As the voices faded, Jacob lay motionless, his mind racing. The betrayal was deeper than he had imagined, but with it came a clarity he hadn't felt in years. He couldn't trust Clara, not anymore. If he wanted to protect himself, he would have to act. But first he needed strength. The hours stretched into evening, and the rain outside turned to a steady drizzle. Erica returned to check on him, her presence once again a balm to his frayed nerves. She adjusted his pillows and brought him a cup of broth, her movements careful and deliberate. "How are you holding up?" she asked, her voice soft. Jacob hesitated, then decided to confide a small part of his truth. "I overheard something yesterday. My wife. She's not who I thought she was." Erica paused, her brow furrowing with concern. She didn't press him for details, but her eyes held a quiet understanding. "Sometimes people show their true colors when we're at our most vulnerable," she said gently. "It's hard, but it's better to know the truth." Her words resonated with Jacob, though they also stung. He had spent years building a life with Clara, believing in their partnership. Now, that foundation felt like it was crumbling beneath him. "You're stronger than you think," Erica added, her tone firm. "I've seen patients come back from things they thought they'd never survive. You can too." Jacob nodded, her words a small comfort. He wasn't sure if he believed them yet, but he wanted to. For Emily's sake, if not his own, he needed to find a way through this. That night, Jacob's thoughts turned to his daughter. Emily was only 10, bright and full of life, with Clara's sharp wit and his quiet determination. He hadn't seen her since the accident, and the thought of her being caught in the middle of this turmoil broke his heart. He vowed to protect her, no matter what. Clara could take his money, his businesses, even his reputation, but she wouldn't take Emily. Jacob's love for his daughter was the one thing Clara couldn't tarnish. As sleep finally overtook him, Jacob dreamed of Emily's laughter echoing through their home. It was a bittersweet sound, both a reminder of what he had lost and a beacon guiding him forward. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing. He wouldn't let Clara's betrayal define him. The next morning, Jacob awoke with a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for Emily, for the life they had built together. He would find a way to recover, to regain control of his body and his life. As Erica entered the room, she noticed the change in his demeanor. "You look more determined today," she remarked with a smile. "I am," Jacob said simply. His voice was still weak, but it carried a resolve that hadn't been there before. Erica nodded, her smile widening. "Good. You're stronger than you think, Mr. Morrison. Just take it one step at a time." Jacob knew she was right. He had a long road ahead, but for the first time in days, he felt ready to face it. The days blurred together, each one a mixture of pain, exhaustion, and small victories. Jacob's body was slow to respond, but Erica's steady care and encouragement kept him grounded. Each movement, no matter how slight, felt like reclaiming a piece of himself. A faint twitch in his fingers, the slow rotation of his wrist. These were the building blocks of recovery, and Jacob clung to them like a man clings to a life raft in a stormy sea. Still, the betrayal lingered. Clara's cold words echoed in his mind during the quiet hours, haunting him in ways even the physical pain could not. He thought of their years together, the vacations, the late-night conversations, the moments when they had built their life as a team. To think it was all a facade made his chest ache more than any broken bone. But he wasn't entirely alone. Late one evening, long after the hospital had quieted down, Jacob lay staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The hum of the machines was a comforting monotony, but his mind refused to settle. He heard the faint creak of the door and turned his head slightly. It was Henry, the elderly janitor he'd seen before. Henry shuffled in with his mop and bucket, humming softly under his breath. "Evening, Mr. Morrison," Henry said, his gravelly voice warm and familiar. "You're still awake, huh? Hospital beds will do that to you." Jacob managed a faint smile. "It's hard to sleep. Too much to think about." Henry nodded knowingly as he dipped the mop into the bucket and began cleaning the floor. His movements were slow but deliberate, each stroke of the mop a practiced rhythm. "Thinking's not always a bad thing," he said after a moment. "It's what comes after that matters." Jacob watched him in silence, struck by the simplicity of his words. Henry wasn't polished or eloquent, but there was a quiet wisdom in him that Jacob couldn't ignore. When Henry finished mopping, he turned to Jacob and leaned on the handle of his mop. "You know, I see a lot of folks come through these halls. Some give up, but the ones who don't, well, they surprise you." Jacob hesitated, then spoke quietly. "It's hard not to feel like giving up when everything is falling apart." Henry's gaze softened. "Yeah, I get that. Life can be cruel sometimes, but you've got fight in you, I can see it. Just don't let anyone take that from you." For the first time in days, Jacob felt a glimmer of something he couldn't quite name. Was it hope? Determination? He wasn't sure, but Henry's words stayed with him long after the janitor left the room. The next morning, Erica entered as usual, her cheerful demeanor brightening the sterile room. "Good news, Mr. Morrison," she said, holding up a clipboard. "Your latest tests show improvement. Your strength is coming back little by little." Jacob nodded, grateful for the progress. "That's something at least." Erica set the clipboard aside and adjusted his fore. "It's more than something. You've made it through the hardest part. Now it's about rebuilding." "Rebuilding," Jacob echoed, the word heavy with meaning. He thought of his life outside these walls, the shattered trust, the looming uncertainty. Rebuilding wasn't just about his body. It was about everything. Erica seemed to sense his unease. She pulled a chair closer and sat down, her expression thoughtful. "You know, recovery isn't just physical," she said. "It's mental, emotional, even spiritual in a way. You've been through something traumatic. It's okay to feel like you're starting from scratch." Jacob met her gaze, appreciating her candor. "It feels like everything's slipping away. My family, my work, I don't even know what's left." Erica hesitated before speaking, her voice soft. "Sometimes when everything falls apart, it makes room for something better. You just have to hold on long enough to see it." Her words resonated with Jacob, though he wasn't ready to fully believe them. Still, the kindness in her tone reminded him of Henry's encouragement the night before. Maybe there was truth in their optimism. Maybe there was still something worth fighting for. That afternoon, as Jacob rested, he noticed a commotion outside his room. He heard Erica's voice, calm but firm, followed by the sound of footsteps retreating down the hall. Moments later, she appeared in the doorway, her expression guarded. "Was that Clara?" Jacob asked, his voice tinged with apprehension. Erica nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "She wanted to see you, but I told her you needed rest. I wasn't sure if you were ready to face her." Jacob exhaled slowly, grateful for Erica's intervention. He wasn't ready, not yet. The thought of seeing Clara, of confronting her duplicity, was almost too much to bear. But deep down, he knew the time would come. He couldn't avoid her forever. "Thank you," he said quietly. Erica nodded and left the room, her presence a calming force in the wake of Clara's attempted visit. That evening, as the hospital settled into its nightly routine, Jacob heard a soft knock at the door. He turned his head, expecting Erica or perhaps Henry, but it was neither. A young man stood in the doorway, his clothes slightly rumpled and his hair tousled. His face was familiar, though Jacob couldn't place it. "Mr. Morrison?" the man said hesitantly. I'm Connor. I don't know if you remember me." Jacob frowned, trying to piece together where he had seen this man before. Then it hit him, a fleeting memory of headlights cutting through the dark, of strong hands pulling him from the wreckage of his car. "You," Jacob's voice faltered. "You saved me." Connor stepped into the room, his expression a mix of humility and resolve. "I was just passing by that night. I saw the car and I couldn't just leave you there." Jacob stared at him, overwhelmed by a surge of gratitude. "You risked your life for me. I don't even know how to thank you." Connor shrugged, his hands stuffed into his pockets. "You don't have to thank me. I just did what anyone would do." But Jacob knew better. Not everyone would have rushed toward a burning car, risking their own safety for a stranger. Connor's bravery was extraordinary, and it humbled Jacob in a way he hadn't expected. As they talked, Jacob learned more about Connor. He was a drifter, moving from town to town, taking odd jobs to make ends meet. He didn't have much, but he had a strong sense of right and wrong, and that had been enough to spur him into action that fateful night. "You've been through a lot," Jacob said, his voice steady, "but you didn't let it stop you from doing something incredible. That's not something I'll ever forget." Connor looked down, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I guess I just wanted to help." In that moment, Jacob felt a profound connection to this young man. Connor's selflessness reminded him of the values he had once held dear, values he had lost sight of in the chaos of his life. Meeting Connor was a reminder that kindness, even in the darkest moments, could spark change. As the night wore on, Jacob lay in his bed, his thoughts racing. Connor's bravery, Erica's unwavering support, and Henry's quiet wisdom had all left a mark on him. These people, strangers in many ways, had shown him a kindness he hadn't expected. It gave him hope, a flicker of belief that he could rebuild not just his body, but his life. Jacob stared out the window at the city lights flickering in the distance. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to imagine a future not the one Clara had planned, but one he could create for himself. He didn't know what it would look like yet, but he knew one thing: he wouldn't face it alone. The hospital room was quiet, save for the steady rhythm of the monitors and the occasional muffled sound of activity from the hallway. Jacob sat propped up against his pillows, his mind awash with new thoughts after Connor's visit the previous evening. The young man's selflessness lingered in his mind like a warm ember, staving off the chill of Clara's betrayal. Connor's words had sparked something in Jacob, a sense of gratitude. Yes, but also a deep curiosity. He wanted to know more about the man who had risked everything to save him, and he wanted to understand what had compelled him to act when so many others might have walked away. Later that morning, Erica entered with her usual gentle demeanor. She carried a tray with a small bowl of oatmeal and a cup of tea, her steps careful and deliberate. Jacob managed a faint smile at her presence. She had become a constant in his days here, a reminder that not all connections in life were transactional or self-serving. "Good morning," Erica said, setting the tray down on the bedside table. "How are we feeling today?" Jacob shrugged slightly, the motion still taxing on his sore muscles. "Better, I think. I can almost feel like myself again." "That's progress," she said with a warm smile. "You're healing, Mr. Morrison. Slowly but surely." As she adjusted the pillow behind his back, Jacob hesitated, then spoke. "Erica, do you remember the man who visited last night? Connor?" She nodded. "I saw him leaving. He seemed nervous but kind." "Why?" Jacob stared out the window, the city skyline blurred by morning haze. "He saved my life, pulled me out of that car when no one else would." His voice was heavy with both awe and disbelief. "I owe him everything, but I barely know him." Erica paused, her expression thoughtful. "Sometimes the people who impact our lives the most are the ones we least expect. Maybe that's why they're so special, they act without expecting anything in return." Jacob considered her words as he picked up the spoon and stirred his oatmeal absent-mindedly. Erica was right. Connor had no reason to help him, and yet he had done so without hesitation. It was a reminder that the world wasn't entirely cold, even if Clara's actions had made it feel that way. Later that afternoon, as Jacob rested, his thoughts drifted to Clara. Her voice still echoed in his mind, sharp, calculating, devoid of the love he had once thought unshakable. He replayed the years of their marriage, searching for signs he might have missed, cracks in the foundation that had been there all along. It was the early days of their relationship, long before the businesses, the success, and the weight of expectation. Jacob remembered how Clara had charmed him with her confidence, her ability to light up a room with her wit and ambition. She had been a force of nature, and he had been drawn to her like a moth to a flame. Their first home was modest, a small apartment overlooking a park. Jacob had spent long hours working to establish his first restaurant, pouring everything he had into the venture. Clara had been supportive, or at least he had believed she was. She had encouraged him to dream big, to build something lasting for their family. But as the years passed and Jacob's success grew, so did Clara's appetite for more. Her encouragement turned to expectations, her warmth to cold ambition. She began to see their life not as a partnership, but as a means to an end. Jacob had dismissed it at first, chalking it up to stress or the natural evolution of their relationship. He had convinced himself that love was enough to bridge the gaps. Now, lying in this hospital bed, Jacob saw the truth clearly for the first time. Clara hadn't changed overnight. The signs had been there all along, subtle, yes, but unmistakable. He had simply been too blind, too trusting to see them. The sound of a knock at the door pulled Jacob from his thoughts. He looked up to see Henry standing in the doorway, his mop and bucket in tow. The older man gave him a small nod before stepping inside. "Afternoon, Mr. Morrison," Henry said, his voice as steady as ever. "Thought I'd stop by and see how you're doing." Jacob smiled faintly. "Better, I think, thanks to people like you." Henry raised an eyebrow as he leaned on the handle of his mop. "Me? I'm just the guy who cleans up after everyone. You're the one doing the hard work." Jacob shook his head. "It's more than that, Henry. The little things matter, the encouragement, the kindness. It's what keeps people going." Henry's expression softened. He set the mop aside and pulled up a chair, sitting across from Jacob. "You know," he began, "I've seen a lot of people come and go in this place. Some fight like hell to get better, and some, well, they let the weight of it all crush them. But you got a spark in you. I can see it." Jacob chuckled softly, though the sound was tinged with weariness. A spark, huh? I don't feel like much of a fighter. That's because you're in the middle of it, Henry said. But trust me, you're stronger than you think. You just need to hold on to that spark long enough to see what it can become. Jacob nodded, Henry's words settling over him like a bomb. He didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time, he felt like he wasn't facing it entirely alone. That evening, as the hospital grew quiet, Jacob found himself staring out the window again. The city lights flickered like distant stars, a reminder of the world that continued to move on without him. He thought of Emily, his bright, curious daughter who had always been his anchor. He hadn't seen her since the accident, and the ache of missing her was almost unbearable. He wondered what Clara had told her. Did she know her father was in the hospital? Did she think he was coming back? The thought of Emily being caught in the middle of this betrayal filled Jacob with a renewed sense of purpose. He would fight for her, for their relationship, no matter what it took. As sleep finally claimed him, Jacob dreamed of simpler times of family dinners and laughter, of Emily running through the backyard chasing fireflies. It was a bittersweet reminder of what he was fighting for, but it was enough to give him hope. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing. He wasn't done yet. There was still a life waiting for him, a chance to rebuild. And this time, he would make sure it was built on something real. Jacob woke to the soft gray light of early morning streaming through the hospital window. The city outside seemed muffled, subdued by a gentle mist that clung to the streets and buildings. For a moment, he lay still, listening to the faint hum of the monitors and the distant sounds of nurses beginning their rounds. The quiet felt different today, less suffocating, more focused. A sense of purpose had begun to take root within him. The memories of his conversation with Henry lingered. Hold on to that spark, Henry had said, and Jacob intended to do just that. He wasn't sure how, but he knew it was time to start thinking ahead. Lying in this bed, helpless and silent, wasn't going to protect what mattered most: his daughter, his business, or the life he'd worked so hard to build. Erica arrived shortly after sunrise, as she always did, carrying a tray with his breakfast. She greeted him with her usual warmth, her presence a steadying force in his unpredictable days. "Good morning, Mr. Morrison," she said, setting the tray down beside him. "How are we feeling today?" "Better," Jacob replied, his voice stronger than it had been in days. He attempted a small smile. "Thanks to you and the others around here." Erica pulled a chair closer and began checking his vitals. "You're making progress, Jacob. Little by little, but it's progress." Jacob hesitated, then decided to speak. "Erica, I need your help with something." Her brow furrowed slightly, and she paused in her work. "Of course. What do you need?" "I need to start taking control of my life again," he said, his voice steady despite the weight of his words. "And I don't think I can do it from this bed." Erica leaned back, considering his words carefully. "Jacob, I understand, but you're still recovering. You need time to heal." "I know," he said, meeting her gaze. "But time isn't on my side. Clara, she's not waiting around. I overheard her talking about my will, about my business. She's planning something, Erica, and I can't just sit here and let it happen." Erica's eyes softened with understanding. She had seen the pain in his eyes since the day he'd first mentioned Clara, though he hadn't shared the full extent of what he had overheard. "What do you need me to do?" "I need to leave," Jacob said simply. "Not forever, just for a short while. I need to see what's happening outside these walls. I need to act before it's too late." Erica hesitated, her concern evident. "Jacob, this is risky. You're still weak, and if something happens—" "Please," Jacob interrupted, his voice firm but pleading. "I'll take full responsibility. I can't stay here and do nothing." Erica sighed, her hands clasped in her lap. "If we do this, we have to be careful. No one else can know, not even Dr. Porter. We'll have to time it right." Jacob nodded, relief washing over him. "Thank you, Erica. I won't forget this." The rest of the day passed in quiet anticipation. Erica made careful preparations, gathering the supplies they would need to ensure Jacob's safety outside the hospital. She borrowed a cane from a colleague, packed a small bag with emergency medications, and discreetly arranged for a private driver who wouldn't ask questions. Meanwhile, Jacob focused on conserving his energy. Every small movement felt like a step forward, lifting his arm, turning his head, even sitting upright for a few moments at a time. The physical effort was exhausting, but the thought of regaining control over his life kept him going. As evening fell, Erica returned with the supplies in hand. "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice low. Jacob nodded, though a flicker of doubt crossed his mind. He was still far from the man he had been before the accident, but this wasn't about strength, it was about resolve. The journey down the hospital corridor was slow and arduous. Erica supported Jacob on one side, while he leaned heavily on the cane with the other. Each step was a battle, his body protesting the effort, but he pushed through the pain. They slipped out a side entrance, avoiding the prying eyes of nurses and staff. The cool night air hit Jacob's face, sharp and invigorating after weeks inside. The world beyond the hospital walls felt both foreign and familiar, like a memory he was only beginning to reclaim. The driver greeted them without a word, helping Erica settle Jacob into the back seat. The ride was quiet, the hum of the engine a soothing backdrop to Jacob's racing thoughts. He stared out the window, watching the city pass by in a blur of lights and shadows. When they arrived at his home, Jacob's heart sank. The house was dark, save for a faint glow in the upstairs window, his study. The sight of it filled him with a mix of longing and dread. This had once been his sanctuary, the place where he had planned his future and dreamed of a better life for his family. Now it felt like a battleground. Erica helped him to the door, her hand steady on his arm. Jacob reached into his pocket for the key, but it didn't fit. He frowned, trying again, but the lock refused to turn. "She changed the locks," Jacob muttered, his voice tight with anger. Erica's grip on his arm tightened slightly. "What do we do now?" Jacob didn't answer. He pressed the doorbell, the familiar chime echoing inside. Footsteps approached, and the door swung open to reveal a man Jacob didn't recognize. He was tall and broad, wearing one of Jacob's robes, the robe Jacob's mother had gifted him years ago. The sight of it made Jacob's blood boil. The man stared at Jacob, his expression shifting from surprise to smug indifference. "You must be Jacob," he said, leaning casually against the doorframe. "Clara told me you might show up." Jacob clenched his fist around the cane, his knuckles white. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice low and steady. "I'm Ben," the man replied, a smirk tugging at his lips. "Clara's partner." Before Jacob could respond, Clara's voice called from inside. "Ben, who is it I told you to handle?" She appeared behind him, her face paling when she saw Jacob standing there. For a moment, she seemed frozen, her eyes darting between Jacob and Erica. Then she dropped to her knees, her voice trembling with false remorse. "Jacob, I didn't think. I thought you wouldn't," she trailed off, tears brimming in her eyes. Jacob stared at her, his jaw tight. "Save it, Clara," he said. "You've already shown me who you are." Ben stepped forward, his smug demeanor faltering. "Listen, man." "No," Jacob interrupted, his voice sharp. "You listen. You thought I wouldn't make it. You thought you could bury me and take everything I built. But I'm still here, and I'm not going anywhere." Clara reached for his hand, but Jacob stepped back, leaning heavily on the cane. "5 minutes," he said coldly. "Pack your things and get out of my house." The weight of his words hung in the air, silencing Clara and Ben. Erica stood by his side, her quiet strength bolstering him. For the first time in weeks, Jacob felt a sense of control, not over his body, not entirely, but over his life. As Clara and Ben retreated inside, Jacob turned to Erica. "Thank you," he said quietly. She gave him a small smile. "This is just the beginning, Jacob. You've still got a long way to go." Jacob nodded, the spark within him burning brighter. He wasn't done yet. This was his life, and he was taking it back step by painful step. The door slammed behind Clara and her lover, leaving Jacob standing in the cold night air. The faint glow from the upstairs window illuminated the faint mist hanging in the yard, giving everything an eerie stillness. Jacob tightened his grip on the cane, forcing his legs to hold steady despite the weight pressing on him. Erica lingered nearby, her eyes flickering between him and the house, ready to intervene if he faltered. "You're sure about this?" Erica asked softly, her voice barely cutting through the silence. Jacob nodded, his gaze fixed on the door. It's not a matter of choice. This is my home. I've lost enough already. I won't lose this too. Erica's expression softened, and she stepped closer, resting a steadying hand on his arm. I'll be here if you need me. You don't have to do this alone. Inside, Clara and Ben moved quickly, their low voices carrying faintly through the thin walls. Jacob imagined her packing in a rush, shoving designer clothes and accessories into bags, each item a reminder of the life he had worked so hard to build. The thought made his stomach churn, but he pushed the anger aside. He couldn't afford to let his emotions control him, not now. When the front door opened again, Clara emerged first, her face a mask of strained composure. Ben followed, carrying several bags in his muscular arms, his arrogance noticeably diminished. He refused to meet Jacob's gaze while Clara paused, her lips parting as if to say something. Jacob raised a hand, silencing her before she could begin. Save it, Clara, he said, his voice even. I've heard enough. She hesitated, then dropped her gaze and descended the steps. As they loaded the bags into a waiting car, Jacob felt an odd mix of relief and sorrow. This was the woman he had once loved, the mother of his child, and yet here she was, exposed as a stranger he could no longer trust. When the car pulled away, leaving the driveway empty, Jacob exhaled a shaky breath. His legs threatened to give out, but Erica was there in an instant, slipping an arm around him and helping him inside. The house felt unfamiliar, like a shell of the life he had once known. The furniture was the same, the pictures on the walls untouched, but the warmth was gone. Jacob eased into the chair in the living room, his body protesting every movement. Erica disappeared briefly, returning with a glass of water and a blanket, which she draped over his lap. Thank you, Jacob said, his voice quiet but sincere. She smiled faintly. You don't have to thank me. You're stronger than you realize, Jacob. Tonight proved that. Jacob looked around the room, his eyes landing on a framed photograph on the mantel. It was a picture of him, Clara, and Emily from years ago, taken during a vacation in the mountains. Emily's wide smile stood out, her youthful innocence a stark contrast to the turmoil of the present. I have to protect her, Jacob murmured, more to himself than to Erica. Emily doesn't deserve to be caught in the middle of this. You will, Erica said firmly. But first you need to rest. You've done enough for one night. Jacob nodded, his exhaustion too heavy to resist. As Erica helped him to the guest room, he felt the weight of the day settling over him, but alongside it was a flicker of hope. He had taken the first step, and now he had to find the strength to keep moving forward. The next morning, Jacob woke to the smell of fresh coffee wafting through the house. For a brief moment, he thought it might be Clara, the familiarity of the scent pulling him back to a time when mornings had been simple and filled with routine. But the memory evaporated as he sat up, wincing at the stiffness in his limbs. In the kitchen, Erica stood by the counter, pouring coffee into 2 mugs. She glanced up as he entered, her expression lightening when she saw him moving under his own power. Good morning, she said, sliding a mug across the counter toward him. I wasn't sure how you took it, so I left it black. Jacob managed a faint smile. Black is fine. Thank you. He sat carefully at the table, the warmth of the mug in his hands grounding him. Erica joined him, her demeanor calm but watchful. You need a plan, she said after a moment. Clara's gone, but that doesn't mean she's finished. If what you overheard is true, she'll try to come after your assets. Jacob nodded. I know, and she's already been meddling. The locks, the accounts, I need to figure out how much damage she's done. Erica hesitated before speaking. What about Emily? Have you talked to her? The question hit Jacob like a blow to the chest. He hadn't spoken to his daughter since before the accident, and the thought of her being caught in the middle of this mess filled him with guilt. No, he admitted. Clara's kept her away. I don't even know what she's told her. Erica reached across the table, her hand resting lightly on his. Then, that's where you start. She needs to hear from you, Jacob, your side of things. Jacob stared into his coffee, her words settling over him. Erica was right. Emily was his priority, and if he wanted to protect her, he needed to rebuild their connection. Later that afternoon, Jacob sat in the study, his desk cluttered with old bills and legal documents. The room smelled faintly of cedar and ink, a comforting reminder of the countless hours he had spent here, building the foundation of his business. As he sifted through the papers, a knock at the door startled him. Erica appeared, followed by Connor, who looked slightly sheepish as he stepped into the room. "Hope I'm not interrupting," Connor said, scratching the back of his neck. "Not at all," Jacob replied, setting the papers aside. "Come in." Connor took a seat across from Jacob, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. "I heard you took back the house. That's a big step." Jacob nodded. "It's a start, but there's still a long way to go." Connor hesitated, then leaned forward. "If there's anything I can do to help, just say the word. You gave me a chance when no one else would. I owe you." Jacob studied the young man, struck by the sincerity in his voice. Connor's rough edges were apparent, his disheveled clothes, his guarded demeanor, but there was a fire in him that Jacob couldn't ignore. "There might be something," Jacob said slowly. "I need to rebuild what Clara tried to tear down. That includes my businesses. And from what I've seen, you've got the kind of determination I need." Connor blinked, caught off guard. "Are you saying you want me to work for you?" Jacob smiled faintly. "I'm saying I want you to help me rebuild. You've already proven you're willing to fight for what's right. That's more than I can say for most." Connor nodded, his expression serious. "I won't let you down." As Connor left the room, Jacob felt a sense of purpose returning. He wasn't just fighting to take back what was his, he was building something new, something stronger. And with Erica and Connor by his side, he knew he wasn't alone. That evening, as Jacob sat by the window, the city lights flickering in the distance, he allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in weeks, he felt like he was moving forward. His thoughts drifted to Emily, and he resolved to call her the next day. It was time to rebuild not just his life, but the connections that mattered most. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing. He was ready to face it. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the windows of Jacob's study, casting a warm glow on the papers spread across his desk. For the first time in weeks, he felt a faint sense of normalcy as he sat there, sipping his coffee. But beneath the surface, a storm brewed. There was still so much to set right, and at the center of it all was Emily. Jacob stared at his phone for what felt like an eternity, his finger hovering over her number. He hadn't spoken to his daughter since before the accident, and the thought of hearing her voice again filled him with equal parts hope and dread. He wondered what Clara had told her, what lies might have been planted in his absence. With a deep breath, he pressed the call button. The line rang once, then twice, before a soft voice answered. "Hello?" Jacob's throat tightened. "Emily, it's Dad." There was a pause, and for a moment, Jacob feared she might hang up. Then, her voice came through, hesitant but steady. "Dad, are you okay?" Mom said. "She said you were really hurt." "I'm okay," Jacob said quickly, his voice cracking slightly. "I've been in the hospital, but I'm getting better now." Another pause. He could sense her confusion, the questions she didn't know how to ask. "Mom said you might not wake up," she said quietly. "She said, you might not come back." Jacob's chest tightened. "Emily, listen to me. I'm here. I'm alive, and I'm not going anywhere. I promise." Her voice wavered. "Why didn't you call sooner?" Jacob closed his eyes, guilt washing over him. "I wanted to, sweetheart. I've been trying to get better, trying to come home to you. I'm sorry I didn't call sooner." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and Jacob held his breath. Finally, Emily spoke, her voice small but filled with emotion. "I miss you, Dad." Jacob's heart swelled. "I miss you too, Emily. More than you know. Can I see you? Maybe we can spend some time together this weekend?" "Okay," she said softly. "I'd like that." Relief flooded through Jacob, and he smiled for the first time that morning. "Good. I'll pick you up Saturday. We'll do something fun, just the two of us." "Okay," Emily said again, her voice brighter now. "I'll see you then." As the call ended, Jacob set the phone down, his hand trembling slightly. It was a small step, but it was a start. He had a long way to go to rebuild their relationship, but he was determined to make it right. Later that day, Jacob sat with Connor in the living room. the two of them poring over spreadsheets and business documents. Connor had taken to the work quickly, his sharp mind and keen instincts proving invaluable. "This one," Connor said, pointing to a highlighted line on the spreadsheet. "Clara's been siphoning money into a separate account. She's been careful not to take too much at once, but over time, it adds up." Jacob frowned, his jaw tightening. "How much are we talking?" "Close to 50,000, Connor replied. "She's been at it for months, maybe longer." Jacob exhaled slowly, anger simmering beneath the surface. "I'll need to contact the bank, freeze the account if I can, and I'll have to speak to my lawyer about filing charges." Connor nodded. "Do you think she'll fight back?" "She'll try," Jacob said, his voice firm. "But I'm done letting her win." Connor leaned back, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You're tougher than you look, Mr. Morrison." Jacob chuckled softly. "I don't feel tough most days, but I guess I don't have much of a choice." "Sometimes, that's when people surprise themselves," Connor said, "when they don't have a choice." That evening, Erica joined them for dinner in the kitchen. It was a simple meal: grilled chicken, roasted vegetables, and a small salad, but it felt significant. For the first time in weeks, Jacob wasn't eating alone. The warmth of their conversation filled the room, easing the tension that had settled over his home. "You've come a long way, Jacob," Erica said as they cleared the dishes. "I hope you're proud of yourself." Jacob smiled faintly. "I couldn't have done it without you and Connor. You've both been more than I could have asked for." Connor shrugged, his expression modest. "Just doing my part. You gave me a chance when no one else would. And I'll keep giving you chances," Jacob said. "You've earned it." As the evening wore on, Jacob found himself alone in the living room, the house quiet around him. He stared out the window, the city lights flickering in the distance. His thoughts drifted to Emily, to the weekend ahead, and to the road that lay before him. He thought of Clara and the damage she had caused. There was still so much to untangle, so much to repair. But for the first time, Jacob felt like he could face it. He wasn't alone anymore. Erica's kindness, Connor's loyalty, and the promise of reconnecting with Emily gave him the strength he needed to keep moving forward. As he leaned back in his chair, Jacob allowed himself a rare moment of peace. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in weeks, it felt like it held possibilities rather than pitfalls. He was ready to face whatever came next, step by step, with the people who stood by him. Saturday arrived with the warmth of spring, teasing the edges of winter's chill. Jacob woke early, the excitement of seeing Emily for the first time in weeks, pushing aside his usual stiffness and fatigue. He spent extra time getting ready, making sure his shirt was ironed and his cane polished. Erica noticed his effort as she passed by the hallway. "You're looking sharp this morning," she said with a smile. Jacob chuckled softly. "I'm seeing my daughter today. I want everything to be perfect." Erica's expression softened. "She's going to be so happy to see you, Jacob. Just be yourself, that's all she needs." Jacob nodded, her words both comforting and grounding. He felt a twinge of nervousness but pushed it aside. Today was about reconnecting, and he wasn't going to let anything ruin it. At precisely 11, Jacob pulled into the driveway of Clara's new home. It was a modest two-story house in a quiet neighborhood, a far cry from the luxury they had once shared. He noted the unfamiliar car parked out front, undoubtedly Ben's. The thought made his stomach churn, but he quickly refocused as the door opened and Emily stepped out. "Dad," she called, her face lighting up as she bounded down the steps. Jacob stepped out of the car, leaning heavily on his cane, and opened his arms. Emily ran into his embrace, her warmth and energy filling the void that had lingered in his heart for weeks. "You look good, Dad," Emily said, pulling back to study him. "Better than I expected." Jacob smiled, brushing a stray hair from her face. "You look amazing, Em. I've missed you so much." "I missed you too," she said, her voice tinged with emotion. Behind her, Clara appeared in the doorway, her arms crossed and her expression guarded. Jacob's smile faded as their eyes met, but he forced himself to remain calm for Emily's sake. "Don't keep her out too late," Clara said curtly. "She has homework." Jacob nodded, keeping his response neutral. "Of course." Without another word, Clara retreated inside, the door closing behind her. Jacob sighed, turning back to Emily with a smile. "Ready to go?" Yeah, she said eagerly, climbing into the passenger seat. They spent the day at a nearby park, walking slowly along the paths and stopping for ice cream at a small stand by the lake. Jacob let Emily do most of the talking, soaking in her stories about school, her friends, and the books she was reading. He marveled at how much she had grown in such a short time, her confidence and curiosity shining through despite the challenges she had faced. Mom said you've been really busy, Emily said as they sat on a bench overlooking the water. Is that why you didn't call? Jacob hesitated, choosing his words carefully. I've been recovering, Em. After the accident, things were hard, but I should have called sooner. That's on me, and I'm sorry. Emily nodded, her eyes thoughtful. I'm just glad you're okay. I was really scared when Mom told me about the accident. Jacob reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere. That's a promise. That evening, after dropping Emily off at Clara's house, Jacob returned home to find Connor and Erica waiting for him in the living room. Connor was sprawled on the couch, reviewing documents, while Erica sat at the dining table, her laptop open. How was it? Erica asked, glancing up with a smile. Jacob sank into the armchair, his exhaustion tempered by the warmth in his voice. It was perfect. Emily's incredible. I've missed so much, but I won't let that happen again. Connor grinned. Glad to hear it. Family's important. Jacob nodded, then gestured to the papers on the table. What's all this? Erica's smile faded slightly. We've been going through the evidence you gave us, the financial records, the accounts Clara was using. It's worse than we thought. Connor leaned forward, tapping a document with his pen. She wasn't just skimming money. She's been falsifying invoices, inflating expenses, and moving funds between accounts to cover her tracks. It's deliberate, calculated fraud. Jacob's jaw tightened. And it's enough to press charges? More than enough, Erica said. We've flagged everything. Your lawyer just needs to file the paperwork. Jacob exhaled slowly, the weight of their discovery settling over him. I knew she was hiding something, but it's worse than I imagined. Connor nodded. She underestimated you. Thought you'd never fight back. Well, she was wrong, Jacob said firmly. It's time to put an end to this. The next morning, Jacob met with his lawyer, a sharp-witted man named Paul Harper. Paul reviewed the evidence with a critical eye, his expression growing grimmer with each passing page. This is solid, Paul said finally, leaning back in his chair. If we present this in court, Clara doesn't stand a chance. But you should know it won't be pretty. She'll fight back. I'm ready, Jacob said, his voice steady. I just want to protect what's mine. Paul nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. You're tougher than you look, Jacob. Let's get to work. Over the next few weeks, the legal battle unfolded. Clara tried to play the victim, claiming ignorance of the fraudulent activity, but the evidence was overwhelming. Her lover, Ben, quickly turned on her, providing additional testimony in exchange for leniency. The court froze Clara's accounts, stripping her of the funds she had stolen, and placed her under investigation for embezzlement. Through it all, Jacob remained focused, drawing strength from Erica, Connor, and Emily. Their support reminded him of what truly mattered: family, integrity, and the life he was rebuilding. On the day of the final hearing, Jacob sat in the courtroom, his hands resting on the polished wood of the table before him. Across the room, Clara sat with her lawyer, her face pale and her posture stiff. When the judge delivered the verdict, Jacob felt a rush of relief. Justice had been served, and Clara would finally be held accountable for her actions. As the gavel struck, Jacob glanced over at Emily, who sat quietly in the gallery beside Erica. Her smile was small but bright, a beacon of hope in the midst of the turmoil. That evening, back at home, Jacob stood by the window, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance. Erica joined him, her presence as steadying as ever. You did it, she said softly. You stood up for yourself, for your family. Jacob nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. I couldn't have done it without you. Without Connor. Without Emily. Erica smiled, her hand resting lightly on his arm. You're stronger than you think, Jacob, and this is just the beginning. Jacob turned to her, his own smile growing. For the first time in months, The future felt bright, filled with possibilities, second chances, and the promise of a life rebuilt on truth and resilience. The air in Jacob's home felt lighter. It wasn't just the legal victory over Clara or the return of stability to his finances. It was the sense of purpose that had begun to replace the emptiness he'd felt since the accident. For weeks, he had been reacting, surviving. Now he was building, reclaiming his life one step at a time. Connor and Erica had stayed late the night of the court's decision, sharing a quiet celebration. They toasted with glasses of sparkling water, Jacob's choice, over anything stronger, and exchanged stories about the journey that had brought them all together. Connor spoke of the night. He pulled Jacob from the burning wreckage, his tone humble and reflective. "I didn't think twice," Connor had said, looking at Jacob across the table. "I saw the flames and thought, if I don't act, he's not going to make it." It wasn't about being brave. It was about doing the right thing. Jacob had nodded, his gratitude deep and unspoken. That act of selflessness had saved his life, and now it was shaping the life he was determined to rebuild. The following morning, Jacob sat in his study, reviewing documents Connor had prepared. The restaurant's finances, once muddied by Clara's schemes, were beginning to stabilize. The team Connor had assembled, a mix of experienced staff and newcomers eager to prove themselves, was flourishing under his leadership. "You're a natural at this," Jacob said, glancing up at Connor, who stood by the window. "I don't know how I ever ran things without you." Connor shrugged, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "It's not just me. You've built something people believe in. I'm just helping keep it running." Jacob leaned back in his chair, the tension in his shoulders easing. "I want you to do more than that. I want you to manage the entire operation." Connor blinked, his surprise evident. "Are you serious?" "Completely," Jacob said. "You've earned it, Connor. You care about the people who work for you, and you're not afraid to make tough decisions. That's what this business needs." Connor hesitated, his voice quieter. "I've never managed something like this before. What if I mess it up?" "You won't," Jacob said firmly. "And if you stumble, I'll be here to help you. We'll figure it out together." After a moment, Connor nodded, determination replacing his doubt. "Okay, I won't let you down." With Connor taking on more responsibility at the restaurant, Jacob found himself with time to focus on other priorities. Chief among them was Emily. Their weekend together had been a success, and Jacob was determined to maintain the connection they had rekindled. That afternoon, he picked her up from school, her face lighting up when she spotted his car. As she climbed in, she launched into a story about her day, her enthusiasm contagious. "We had a science experiment today," Emily said, buckling her seatbelt. "I made this volcano, and it actually worked." Everyone cheered when it erupted. Jacob chuckled, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. "Sounds like you've got a future as a scientist." "Maybe," Emily said thoughtfully. "Or an artist. Or maybe both." They spent the evening baking cookies, the kitchen filled with laughter as they fumbled through the recipe. Emily teased Jacob for forgetting to set the timer, and Jacob marveled at how easily they had fallen back into a rhythm, as if the weeks apart had only strengthened their bond. "You're not bad at this, Dad," Emily said, popping a warm cookie into her mouth. Jacob smiled, his heart full. "Neither are you, kiddo." That night, after Emily had fallen asleep on the couch, Jacob sat beside her, watching her peaceful expression. She was his reason for everything, for fighting back against Clara, for rebuilding his life, for believing in a future brighter than his past. Erica's voice broke his reverie. She stood in the doorway, her expression gentle. "She's a lot like you." Jacob glanced at her, his smile faint. "She's better than me. Stronger too." Erica stepped into the room, sitting on the armrest of the couch. "That strength comes from somewhere, Jacob. She sees it in you." Jacob shook his head slightly, his voice soft. "I didn't see it for a long time. I was so wrapped up in work and trying to give her everything I thought she needed that I missed the most important thing, being there." "You're here now," Erica said. "That's what matters." Jacob met her gaze, gratitude and something deeper shining in his eyes. "I couldn't have done any of this without you, Erica. You've been my rock." She smiled, a hint of color rising in her cheeks. "You've done the hard part, Jacob. I've just been along for the ride." The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Jacob worked with Paul Harper to finalize the transition of his assets, ensuring Clara could no longer interfere. He spent evenings with Emily, helping her with homework and encouraging her creative pursuits. And with Erica's help, he began exploring ways to give back to the community that had supported him through his darkest days. One afternoon, as he and Erica walked through the restaurant, Jacob spotted Henry, the janitor from the hospital, sitting at a corner table with a cup of coffee. Jacob approached, his smile broad. "Henry," he said warmly, "what brings you here?" Henry chuckled, setting down his cup. "Connor invited me. Said there was someone I ought to see." Jacob sat across from him, the memories of their late-night conversations in the hospital flooding back. "You were right, about holding on to the spark. It got me through." Henry nodded, his eyes twinkling. "I knew it would. You've got more fight in you than you realize." Jacob leaned forward, his voice earnest. "I want to thank you, Henry, for everything, and I want to offer you something more permanent." Henry raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "A role here," Jacob said. "You're more than a janitor, Henry. You've got wisdom, kindness, and a way of connecting with people that this place could use." Henry hesitated, then smiled. "I'll think about it, but you've already given me something better than any job hope." That evening, as Jacob sat in the living room with Erica, Connor, and Emily, he felt a deep sense of contentment. His life wasn't perfect. There were still challenges to face, wounds to heal, but it was his. He had built something real, something lasting, with the people who mattered most. As laughter filled the room, Jacob realized he was no longer just surviving. He was thriving, surrounded by love, loyalty, and the promise of a brighter future. And for the first time in a long time, he felt whole. The morning dawned crisp and clear, a golden light spilling through the windows of Jacob's home. It was a rare, quiet moment, the kind Jacob had come to cherish. He sat at the kitchen table, a steaming cup of coffee in his hands, and gazed out at the backyard. The trees were budding, signaling the arrival of spring, a season of growth and renewal. The symbolism wasn't lost on him. Today marked a new chapter in his life, not just for him, but for the people around him. Emily had a school art show in the afternoon. Connor was finalizing preparations to assume full management of the restaurant. And Erica, well, she was never far from his thoughts. He couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude for how far they had all come together. Later that morning, as Jacob walked into the restaurant for a meeting with Connor, he was greeted with the hum of activity. The team moved with purpose and precision, the kitchen bustling with energy. Connor stood at the center of it all, his sharp eyes scanning the room, offering a word of encouragement here, a quick adjustment there. "Morning, Mr. Morrison," Connor said as Jacob approached. His tone was casual, but there was pride in his voice. "We're on track for a busy weekend." Jacob smiled, clapping Connor on the shoulder. "You're doing great, Connor. I couldn't ask for a better leader." Connor grinned, the hint of doubt that had once shadowed his expression now gone. "You set the standard, Jacob. I'm just following your example." As the meeting wrapped up, Jacob found himself drawn to the quiet corner table where Henry had been sitting a few days earlier. The old janitor had accepted Jacob's offer to work part-time at the restaurant, mentoring staff and serving as a steady presence for both employees and customers. It was a small gesture, but one that had already begun to make a difference. Henry approached the table, a knowing smile on his face. "You look deep in thought." Jacob chuckled softly. "Just taking it all in? It's been a long road." Henry nodded, sitting across from him. "It's not over yet, but you're doing good work, Jacob. Don't forget to give yourself credit for that." Jacob met his gaze, the weight of Henry's words sinking in. "Thank you, Henry, for everything." Henry waved a hand dismissively. "I just reminded you of what you already had inside you. The rest was all you." By mid-afternoon, Jacob was back at the house, helping Emily get ready for her art show. She flitted around the living room, her excitement infectious as she carefully packed her painting into a portfolio. "Are you nervous?" Jacob asked, watching her with a smile. "A little," Emily admitted, pausing to adjust her hair. "But mostly excited. Do you think people will like it?" "They're going to love it," Jacob said, his voice steady with conviction. "You've put so much heart into it, Emily. That's what matters." Emily beamed, her confidence bolstered. "Thanks, Dad. The art show was held at her school's multipurpose hall, a lively event filled with students, parents, and teachers. Jacob walked alongside Emily, his cane tapping lightly against the floor as they moved through the crowd. Erica had joined them, her presence a comforting anchor. When they reached Emily's display, Jacob felt a swell of pride. Her painting of vibrant, swirling mix of colors that seemed to dance on the canvas stood out among the others. It was bold and full of life, much like Emily herself. As people stopped to admire her work, Emily stood a little taller, her confidence growing with each compliment. Jacob watched her from a distance, his heart full. She was thriving, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had truly been a part of that. "You've done well with her," Erica said softly, stepping beside him. Jacob turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "I've had a lot of help." Erica smiled, her eyes warm. "She's lucky to have you. And so am I." Jacob's breath caught, her words hitting him with a depth he hadn't expected. He looked at her, the gratitude and admiration he felt for her spilling over. "I don't know what I would have done without you, Erica. You've been my rock through all of this." She placed a hand on his arm, her touch gentle. "You didn't need saving, Jacob. You just needed someone to remind you of who you are." That evening, back at home, the house was filled with a quiet sense of celebration. Emily sprawled on the couch, recounting every detail of the art show while Jacob and Erica listened with amused smiles. Connor stopped by briefly, bringing a bottle of sparkling cider to toast to Emily's success. As the evening wound down, Jacob found himself alone on the back porch, the cool night air wrapping around him like a familiar embrace. He stared up at the stars, his thoughts drifting over the past few months. The accident, the betrayal, the slow climb back to himself. It had been a journey filled with pain and uncertainty, but also moments of unexpected kindness and unyielding hope. He thought of Clara, now facing the consequences of her actions, and felt a sense of closure. He didn't hate her, he couldn't, but he had let go of the anger, the bitterness. It was time to move forward. Erica joined him, a blanket draped over her shoulders. She sat beside him, her presence as steady and grounding as ever. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, her voice soft. Jacob took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill his lungs. "How far we've come. How much I have to be grateful for." Erica smiled, leaning against him. "You've built something amazing, Jacob. Not just the business, but the life around it. You've got people who care about you, who believe in you. That's something worth holding on to." Jacob turned to her, his voice filled with quiet determination. "And I plan to, starting with you." Erica blinked, her surprise quickly giving way to a warm smile. "I'm not going anywhere, Jacob. You're stuck with me." Jacob chuckled, a rare sound of pure joy escaping him. "Good, because I'm not letting go." The night ended with a simple toast. The four of them, Jacob, Erica, Emily, and Connor, gathered around the dining table. There was no grand celebration, no fanfare, just the quiet comfort of being surrounded by people who mattered. Jacob raised his glass, his voice steady, to second chances, and to the people who remind us that they're worth fighting for. As their glasses clinked, Jacob felt a sense of peace settle over him. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, he was ready to face it not alone, but with the people who had stood by him when he needed them most. The stars outside shone brightly, a reminder that even in the darkest nights, light could be found. Jacob smiled, the spark within him burning brighter than ever. As Jacob stood by the window later that evening, watching the stars with Erica by his side, he felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey he had endured. Turning to her with a smile, he said, "You know, it's not just the big moments that matter. It's the small ones, the ones where you realize how much you've grown, how far you've come." She nodded, her voice soft. "It's about remembering to keep moving forward, no matter what." Jacob glanced out at the city lights one last time, a spark of determination in his eyes. "And maybe," he added with a grin, "it's about sharing what we've learned so others can find their way too." If you've enjoyed this story of resilience, growth, and the power of unexpected kindness, don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories. Stay with us as we explore journeys that remind us of the strength we all have within. Together, We'll uncover the light in life's most challenging moments.